The sun barely peeked over the horizon, casting a faint orange glow through the dusty blinds of Jim Harper's bedroom window. At 67, Jim wasn't the kind of guy who leapt out of bed ready to seize the day. No, those days were long gone, buried somewhere in the grease-stained memories of his old auto shop, where he used to fix engines with the kind of swagger that made the younger mechanics jealous. Now, mornings were a slow, creaky slog. His knees popped like a rusty hinge as he swung his legs over the side of the bed, and his back groaned in protest. Getting old ain't for sissies, he muttered to himself, a half-hearted chuckle escaping his lips. But deep down, Jim wasn't laughing. He shuffled across the faded hardwood floor of his small house in suburban Ohio, the kind of place where picket fences still stood crooked but proud. The air smelled faintly of motor oil, a stubborn ghost from his decades tinkering with carburetors and spark plugs. In the kitchen, he flipped on the coffee maker, the gurgling sound filling the silence. No breakfast today. Same as yesterday. Same as the day before that. Who's got time to cook at my age? He'd grumble if anyone asked. Truth was, he hadn't eaten a proper morning meal in years. Coffee was his fuel, black, strong, and bitter, just like the mood that seemed to settle deeper into his bones with every passing day. Jim plopped into his worn-out recliner, the springs squeaking under his weight. He stared at the TV, not bothering to turn it on. Outside, the neighborhood buzzed faintly, kids laughing on their way to the bus stop, a dog barking at a squirrel. But inside, it was just Jim, the coffee mug warming his calloused hands, and a creeping fog in his head he couldn't quite shake. He took a sip, wincing as the heat stung his tongue. Gotta be awake for something, he thought. But for what? The days blurred together, now endless hours of sitting, sipping, and staring. He wasn't sure when it started, this slow unraveling. But lately, it felt like his body and mind were betraying him in ways he couldn't ignore. Take yesterday, for instance. He'd been out in the driveway, fiddling with the lawnmower that hadn't worked since last summer. His neighbor, good old what's-his-name, strolled over, waving a friendly hand. "Morning, Jim. How's it going?" The guy had said, all smiles. Jim froze. His tongue felt thick, useless. What was his name? Tom? Tim? No, wait, Terry. The harder he tried to grab it, the faster it slipped away, like oil through his fingers back in the shop. Mornin', he'd mumbled back, forcing a grin. Same old, same old." The guy nodded and walked off, oblivious to the panic clawing at Jim's chest. He'd known that man for 15 years. 15 years, and now his name was just gone. That wasn't the only thing slipping. His knees ached like they were full of gravel, and his hands, once steady enough to thread a needle through a gasket, trembled when he tried to pour creamer he didn't even use. He'd catch himself zoning out mid-thought, staring at the wall like it held some secret he'd forgotten to unlock. And the tiredness? It wasn't just "I need a nap" tired. It was a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of coffee could fix. He'd laugh it off sometimes, saying, "Well, I've earned a rest after 40 years of busting my hump." But the truth gnawed at him. This wasn't rest. This was something else. Jim didn't know it yet, but those mornings, the ones he'd spent shrugging off breakfast, guzzling coffee like it was water, and sinking into that recliner for hours, were quietly killing him. 8 little habits, innocent enough on their own, but together, they were a slow poison seeping into his body and brain, especially now that he'd crossed the 65 mark. The science backs it up. Studies from places like the National Institute on Aging say skipping breakfast messes with your blood sugar and memory, while sitting too long turns your muscles to mush and your heart into a ticking clock. But Jim didn't read studies. He didn't even know there was a problem. Not yet. That morning, as he sat there nursing his third cup of coffee, black as tar and twice as thick, something shifted. He glanced out the window and saw his grandson, Ethan, kicking a soccer ball in the yard next door. The kid was 7, all energy and grins, the kind of boy who'd beg Jim to play until the old man couldn't say no. Jim smiled faintly, remembering the days he'd chase Ethan around, pretending to be a monster while the kid squealed with delight. But now, he couldn't even imagine running. His legs felt like lead, and his breath came short just thinking about it. Maybe tomorrow, he told himself, like he always did. Tomorrow never came. He took another sip, the bitterness coating his throat, and that's when it hit him, a dull, nagging question he couldn't shake. Was this it? Was this what the rest of his life would be? Aches and fog and forgotten names. He thought back to his old shop days, the smell of gasoline and the roar of engines, the way he'd strut out of the garage with a wrench in hand like he owned the world. Where'd that guy go? He wasn't dead, not yet, but he sure as hell wasn't living either. The coffee mug trembled slightly in his grip as he set it down. He rubbed his temples, trying to push away the headache creeping in. Maybe it was the caffeine. Maybe it was the lack of food. Or maybe it was the weight of realizing he'd let himself slip this far without even noticing. He didn't have a name for it yet, this thing eating at him. But it was there, lurking in the creak of his joints and the blank spots in his memory. 8 morning habits: no breakfast, too much coffee, sitting like a lump, ignoring water, sleeping in late, scrolling his phone first thing, skipping sunlight, dodging anything resembling exercise were dragging him down a road he didn't want to travel. And at 67, that road was getting shorter every day. Jim leaned back in the recliner, the springs groaning louder this time, and stared at the ceiling. A spider web stretched across the corner, delicate and unnoticed until now. He snorted softly. Kinda like me, he thought. Falling apart, and nobody's paying attention. But then he stopped. Was that true? Was it too late to fix? Or was there still a spark of that old Jim in there somewhere, buried under the coffee stains and the cobwebs? He didn't have the answer. Not yet. But as he watched Ethan kick that ball, a tiny flicker of something, hope, maybe, stirred in his chest. Maybe it wasn't over. Maybe he could still fight back. The question hung there, heavy and unanswered. What if the way you start your day is secretly stealing your future? Jim didn't know it, but that question was about to change everything. And what about you? Think about it for a second. Those little things you do every morning: skipping breakfast, chugging coffee, staring at screens. Do you ever wonder what they're doing to you? Especially if you're over 65 or heading that way fast. Stick with me here, because Jim's story is just getting started. He's about to find out what's really killing him and how to stop it before it's too late. Jim Harper's old pickup truck rattled down the cracked asphalt of Main Street, the engine coughing like it was just as tired as he was. It was a Thursday morning, and the Ohio sky hung low and gray, the kind of weather that made you want to crawl back into bed. Jim didn't, though not because he was some morning warrior, but because he'd promised his daughter he'd grab milk and bread from the store. "Can't let Sarah down," he muttered, gripping the steering wheel with hands that still smelled faintly of motor oil, even after all these years. The radio crackled to life as he fumbled with the dial, skipping past static and country tunes until a voice cut through the noise: a podcast about health, of all things. After 65, your morning routine can make or break you, the host said, all chipper and smug like he'd never felt a joint pop in his life. Jim snorted. Yeah, right. What's this guy know about my mornings? He was about to switch it off when the next line stopped him cold. Skipping breakfast doesn't just leave you hungry, it messes with your brain. Studies from the National Institute on Aging show it spikes your blood sugar and doubles your risk of memory loss. Jim's foot eased off the gas. Memory loss. His mind flashed to yesterday, standing there like a fool, unable to name his own neighbor. The podcast kept going. And sitting too long. Mayo Clinic says it's like handing your muscles a pink slip, they just quit on you. Add in too much coffee, and you're dehydrating yourself into an early grave. Jim's stomach twisted. He glanced at the empty passenger seat where his third coffee of the morning sat, half drunk and cold. 3 cups before 10 a.m. Was that too much? He'd always figured it kept him sharp, but now his head throbbed, and his mouth felt like sandpaper. The host wasn't done. No water, sleeping in, scrolling your phone first thing, dodging sunlight, skipping exercise. Those little habits? They're not so little after 65. They're a death sentence in slow motion. Jim's knuckles whitened on the wheel. 8 habits. 8 things he did every single day without a second thought. Was this guy talking about him? He pulled into the grocery store parking lot, the truck lurching to a stop. For a minute, he just sat there, engine ticking as it cooled, the podcast's words bouncing around his skull. Death sentence in slow motion. Dramatic, sure, but it hit too close. He thought about his creaky knees, the way his brain blanked out on names, the exhaustion that clung to him like damp clothes. Maybe it wasn't just getting old. Maybe it was something he was doing. Or not doing. He grabbed the coffee cup, stared at it like it was a traitor, then tossed it into the trash bin outside the store. Fine, he grumbled. Let's see if this crap's for real. But old habits die hard, and Jim wasn't ready to surrender just yet. Back home, he sank into his recliner, the springs whining under him like an old friend. No breakfast, still bread and milk were for Sarah, not him. He skipped the coffee this time, but only because his hands were shaking too much to pour it. Instead, he grabbed his phone, scrolling through blurry photos of Ethan's soccer games and spam emails about car warranties. The podcast nagged at him, but he shoved it down. I've been fine for 67 years, he told himself. What's a little sitting gonna do? Kill me? He laughed, but it came out hollow. Then came the moment that cracked his stubborn shell. Ethan burst through the front door that afternoon, all sweaty and wild-haired from playing outside. Grandpa, come kick the ball with me, the kid shouted, tossing a scuffed-up soccer ball at Jim's feet. Jim grinned. Ethan's energy was contagious, but as he hauled himself out of the recliner, his legs wobbled. He took 2 steps toward the yard, bent to pick up the ball, and whoosh, the world tilted. His knee buckled, his hand shot out to grab the door frame, and he barely caught himself before kissing the hardwood floor. Ethan froze, wide-eyed. Grandpa, you okay? Jim forced a smile, heart pounding. Yeah, buddy. Just need a sec. He straightened up, but the fear stayed. He'd almost gone down right there, in front of his grandson. What if he'd fallen? What if he'd broken something? What if Ethan had to watch him crumple like some fragile old relic? The podcast's voice echoed back, sitting too long. No exercise. Dehydration. He hadn't drunk a drop of water all day. His coffee obsession, his lazy mornings, they weren't just quirks. They were chains pulling him closer to a day he couldn't get back up. That night, Jim sat at his kitchen table, the bread and milk still unopened in their bags. He scribbled on a napkin with a shaky hand. 8 habits he'd heard on that damn podcast. 1. Skipping breakfast. 2. Sitting for hours. 3. Too much coffee. 4. No water. 5. Sleeping in late. 6. Phone first thing. 7. No sunlight. 8. No exercise. He stared at the list, each word a tiny jab. This can't be me, he whispered. But it was. Every single one. The science wasn't lying. Research from the European Food Safety Authority said too much caffeine dries you out, while the American Heart Association warned that no movement kills circulation. And that memory thing? The National Institute on Aging wasn't kidding. Jim's brain was fogging up, and he'd been too stubborn to see it. He crumpled the napkin, then smoothed it out again. Okay, he said to the empty room. Maybe I'm not fine. Maybe I'm screwing myself. But knowing it and fixing it? 2 different beasts. He wasn't some fitness guru with a smoothie blender and a yoga mat. He was Jim Harper, grease monkey, coffee addict, king of the recliner. Change sounded exhausting. Still, that near fall stuck with him. Ethan's worried little face stuck with him. He couldn't keep pretending this was normal. Hey, if you're watching this right now, let's hit pause for a sec. I've got a question for you. Comment the number 2 down below if you're with me this far, and tell me, which of these habits are you guilty of? Skipping breakfast? Too much coffee? Sitting till your legs go numb? I'm dying to know. Drop it in the comments, because Jim's not the only one who might need a wake-up call here. Let's keep going. Jim didn't sleep much that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the spider web still mocking him from the corner. The podcast had rattled him, sure, but it was Ethan's voice. Grandpa, you okay? That wouldn't let go. He pictured himself a year from now, 5 years from now. A wheelchair? A nursing home? Forgetting Ethan's name the way he'd forgotten his neighbors? His chest tightened. I'm not there yet, he told himself. I can't be. But the truth was staring him down. Those 8 morning habits weren't just annoying little ruts. They were shovels, digging his grave one lazy sunrise at a time. By the time the clock hit 3 a.m., Jim made a decision. He didn't know how, and he sure as hell didn't know if he'd stick with it. But he had to try something. Anything. Because if he didn't stop now, he might not get another chance. The question burned in his mind, sharp and urgent. If you're over 65, or even close, do you see yourself in me? He wasn't sure he liked the answer, but he was damn sure he wasn't ready to give up. Jim Harper woke up the next morning with a fire in his gut he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the kind of fire that comes from a good night's sleep. God knows he barely got 3 hours, tossing and turning with that crumpled napkin of bad habits glaring at him from the nightstand. No, this was something else. It was Ethan's voice, small and scared. "Grandpa, you okay?" Looping in his head like a stuck record. It was the memory of his knee buckling, his hand clawing at the doorframe, and the cold sweat that followed. Jim wasn't a quitter. He'd rebuilt engines from scrap, hauled tires in the rain, kept his shop running through recessions. If he could fight for that, he could fight for this. For himself. For Ethan. He shuffled into the kitchen, the hardwood cool under his bare feet. The coffee maker sat there, taunting him with its chipped red paint. "Not today, pal," he muttered, turning his back on it. Step 1. Breakfast. The podcast had drilled it into him. Skipping meals was starving his brain, and the National Institute on Aging wasn't wrong about that memory fog. He rummaged through the pantry, past the stale crackers and a can of soup older than Ethan, until he found a bag of oats Sarah had left last month. Yogurt and oatmeal, he grumbled. Sounds like punishment. But then he remembered something else: walnuts. He'd read somewhere, or maybe heard it on that damn podcast, that they were packed with omega-3s, good for the brain. Alzheimer's Association swore by it. He tossed a handful into the bowl, mixed in some plain yogurt, and sat down. The first bite was, well, awful. Bland and chewy, like eating wet cardboard with nuts. Jim grimaced, but he kept going. "This is for you, kid," he thought, picturing Ethan's gap-toothed grin. Halfway through, something shifted. His stomach stopped growling. His head felt a little clearer, like a windshield wiper had swiped away some of the haze. "Huh," he said aloud, surprised. Maybe this wasn't just hippie nonsense after all. Next up, moving. The American Heart Association said even 10 minutes of walking could get his blood pumping, keep his ticker from giving out. Jim wasn't about to jog. His knees would stage a full-on revolt, but a walk. He could handle that. He laced up his old work boots, the leather cracked but sturdy, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the kind of Ohio morning where you could smell the dew on the grass and hear the faint clang of a flagpole down the street. He started slow, shuffling past the mailbox, then the neighbor's rusty sedan. 5 minutes in, his legs ached, but it wasn't the bad kind of ache. It was the kind that said, "Hey, we're still here." He passed the Little League field at the end of the block, where kids were already tossing baseballs, their shouts echoing off the bleachers. Jim paused, leaning against a chain-link fence. He used to take Ethan there, back when he could still swing a bat without wheezing. Now, he'd been too tired to even watch from the stands. But today, he felt a flicker of something: energy, maybe. He kept going, looping back home after 12 minutes. Not 10, 12. "Take that, Hart," he smirked, wiping sweat from his brow. Water was trickier. Jim hated it. Tasted like nothing, felt like a chore. But the podcast had scared him straight. Dehydration from all that coffee was shrinking his brain, or so the European Food Safety Authority claimed. He filled a glass from the tap, stared at it like it was a bitter enemy, and chugged. It went down cold and clean, and damn if he didn't feel a little less parched. 1 glass, he told himself. Baby steps. He'd tackle the 2 liters they recommended later. Maybe. The rest of the day wasn't perfect. He still slept in 7:30 instead of his usual 9, but it was a start. He caught himself reaching for his phone first thing, scrolling through junk before his eyes were even fully open, but stopped after a minute. "Not today," he growled, tossing it onto the couch. Sunlight. He cracked the blinds, let the morning rays spill in. No yoga or meditation, yet Jim wasn't that far gone, but he figured 3 out of 8 wasn't bad for day 1. The real test came that afternoon. Ethan showed up again, soccer ball in tow, bouncing on his heels. "Grandpa, you promised," he chirped, Jim's heart sank. He wasn't ready. His legs still felt like jelly from the walk, and that oatmeal sat heavy in his gut. But those big brown eyes wouldn't take no for an answer. "All right, kid," he said, hauling himself up. "Let's see what I've got." They stepped into the yard, the grass patchy from last summer's heat. Ethan kicked the ball, a wild shot that veered left. Jim lumbered after it, slower than molasses, but he didn't stop. He tapped it back with his toe, grinning as Ethan cheered. "Go, Grandpa." They went back and forth 5 kicks, then 10. Jim's breath came short. His knees complained, but he didn't fall. Not this time. After the 10th kick, Ethan tackled him in a hug, giggling. "You're getting fast again." Jim's eyes stung, and he blinked hard. "Not fast, kid," he rasped, ruffling Ethan's hair. "Just better." That night, Jim sat in his recliner not to rot, but to think. He pulled out that napkin, the ink smudged from his sweaty hands. 3 habits down: breakfast, a walk, some water. 5 to go. It wasn't easy. The coffee withdrawal gave him a headache that thumped like a drum, and his body screamed for the old routine. He missed the buzz, the laziness, the mindless scroll. But then he thought of Ethan's hug, the way his grandson's face lit up. He thought of that little league field, the kids playing without a care. He wasn't there yet, not even close, but he could feel it. A tiny shift, like an engine sputtering back to life. A week in, something wild happened. He was out on his walk 15 minutes now. "Thank you very much," when he passed his neighbor's house. The guy was there, watering his lawn, same friendly wave. "Morning, Jim," he called. And without missing a beat, Jim shot back, "Morning, Ted." Ted. His name was Ted. Jim stopped dead in his tracks, a goofy grin spreading across his face. He remembered. No fumbling, no panic, just Ted. The oatmeal, the walking, the water, it was working. His brain wasn't fixed, not by a long shot, but it was waking up. He still had work to do. Sleeping in was a beast he couldn't tame, yet 6:30 felt like torture. Meditation? He'd tried it once, sitting cross-legged on the floor, and lasted 30 seconds before his back screamed bloody murder. Yoga was a pipe dream. But those small wins: breakfast every day, a walk around the block, a glass of water instead of a 4th coffee, they were stacking up. His knees didn't hurt as much. His hands shook less. And Ethan? That kid was his fuel, his reason to keep pushing. Jim leaned back in the recliner, the springs quieter now, like they approved. He wasn't the man he'd been at 40, wrench in hand, grease up to his elbows. But he wasn't the shell he'd become at 67 either. He was something in between, clawing his way back. "1 habit at a time," he whispered. "That's all it takes." And it hit him then, clear as day. Change didn't have to be big. It just had to start. What about you? You don't need a full overhaul, just 1 small step. Maybe it's a bowl of oats tomorrow. Maybe it's a 5-minute walk. Whatever it is, it's yours to take. Because if Jim can do it, if this stubborn old gearhead can fight back, you can too. The question is, what's your first move? 2 months. That's how long it took Jim Harper to turn the ship around, or at least get it sailing in the right direction. It wasn't a straight line, mind you. There were days he wanted to chuck the oatmeal out the window. Days his legs begged him to skip the walk. Days he stared at that coffee maker like it was an old lover calling him back. But Jim was nothing if not stubborn. He'd rebuilt a '68 Chevy from a rusted heap. He could rebuild himself. And with Ethan's laughter echoing in his ears, he did. It started small, those first shaky steps from part 3. Breakfast every morning, oats, walnuts, a dollop of yogurt. A 15-minute walk that stretched to 20, then 30. A glass of water that became 2, then a whole 2 liters by week 4. Once he figured out adding a slice of lemon made it bearable. The American Heart Association wasn't kidding. His circulation perked up. His knees stopped feeling like they were full of rusty bolts. But Jim didn't stop there. He tackled the rest of those 8 morning killers, one by one, like he was checking off a repair list in his old shop. Sleeping in? Gone. He set an alarm for 6:30 a.m., groaned like a bear every time it blared, but rolled out of bed anyway. The phone? He left it on the kitchen counter till after breakfast. No more scrolling through spam while his coffee went cold. Not that he drank much of it now, 1 cup. Mac's sunlight became his new best friend. He'd step onto the porch, coffee mug in hand, and let the early rays hit his face. A study from the National Institute on Aging said it reset your brain's clock. Jim didn't know the science, but he felt it. Clearer, sharper. Then came the big guns, meditation and yoga. Jim laughed at the idea at first. Me sitting like some guru? Stretching like a pretzel? Get out of here. But Ethan overheard him griping one day and piped up, "Grandpa, you gotta try. It's like fixing your insides." That kid could sell ice to a penguin. So Jim gave it a shot. Meditation was 5 minutes of silence on the couch, eyes closed, breathing deep while his mind raced about oil changes and grocery lists. Then 10 minutes. Yoga was worse. He found a YouTube video for seniors, fumbled through a downward dog that looked more like a drunk giraffe, and nearly tipped over. But he kept at it. A stretch here, a pose there. His back stopped screaming. His balance steadied. The payoff hit like a thunderclap one Saturday morning, 8 weeks in. Ethan showed up, same soccer ball, same wild energy. "Grandpa, let's play something new," he shouted, tossing a mini basketball Jim hadn't seen in years. They headed to the driveway, where an old hoop hung crooked on a pole, rust flaking off the rim. Jim hadn't shot a basket since Ethan was in diapers 5 years, maybe more. "All right, kid," he said, rolling his shoulders. "Let's see if I've still got it." He took the ball, dribbled once clumsy, but steady, and lined up the shot. His knees bent, his arms flexed, and swish the ball sailed through the net, clean as a whistle. Ethan's jaw dropped. "Grandpa, you're a pro." Jim laughed, a real belly laugh that shook the dust off his lungs. "Not yet, buddy." He took another shot, then another. 5 in a row, no wheezing, no wobbling. His breath stayed even, his legs held strong. For the first time in half a decade, Jim Harper played ball with his grandson 20 minutes straight and didn't feel like he'd keel over. That was the moment. Standing there, sweat beading on his forehead, the sun painting the driveway gold, Jim broke. Tears welled up, hot and sudden, and he turned away so Ethan wouldn't see. He wasn't crying because he was tired or sad. He was crying because he'd done it. He'd clawed his way back from the edge past the fog, the aches, the near fall that had scared him straight. Ethan ran over, oblivious, and hugged his legs. "You're the best, Grandpa." Jim wiped his eyes, grinning. "No, kid. You are." Later that day, he sat at the kitchen table, the napkin long gone, replaced by a new list scribbled on a fresh sheet of paper. 8 habits, not the killers, but the lifelines. 1. Eat a real breakfast: oats, nuts, whatever works. 2. Walk 30 minutes, every damn day. 3. Drink 2 liters of water, lemon helps. 4. Wake up at 6:30, no excuses. 5. Skip the phone till you're human again. 6. Get some sunlight, even if it's just 5 minutes. 7. Meditate 10 minutes, breathe deep. 8. Yoga: stretch like you mean it. He taped it to the fridge, a trophy of his fight. The neighborhood noticed. Ted, good old Ted, whose name Jim never forgot, now caught him on a walk one morning. "You're looking spry, Harper," he said, half joking. Jim shrugged, but inside, he beamed. He started leaving little handwritten notes for the neighbors, copies of his 8 habits, slipped into mailboxes with a scrawled, "Try it. Works for me." One lady, Mrs. Carter down the street, stopped him a week later. "Jim, I started the walking. My hip doesn't hurt as much." He nodded, gruff but proud. "Told ya." Looking back, Jim couldn't believe how close he'd come to letting it all slip away. That recliner had been his throne and his prison. The coffee, the laziness, the excuses, they'd nearly buried him. But he stopped. Not too late, not yet. At 67, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. He saw it in the mirror. Less slump in his shoulders, more spark in his eyes. He heard it in his voice, steady when he called out to Ethan. He felt it in his bones, stronger every day. The high point came a week later. Ethan's school had a grandparents' day, and Jim showed up, boots polished, flannel crisp. The kids played games in the gym, and when they needed an extra for tug of war, Ethan dragged him in. Jim gripped the rope, planted his feet, and pulled with a dozen giggling 7-year-olds. They won, and Ethan cheered like it was the Super Bowl. On the drive home, the kid turned to him, serious for once. "Grandpa, you're not old anymore." Jim chuckled, throat tight. "Not today, buddy." That night, under the porch light, Jim stood tall. The air smelled of cut grass and possibility. He wasn't the gearhead of his 40s, strutting out of the shop with a wrench and a swagger. But he wasn't the shell of 2 months ago either, crumbling under coffee stains and cobwebs. He was Jim Harper, 67, flawed, fierce, and alive. He'd found more than health. He'd found himself. And here's the thing, it's not over for you either. Age 65 isn't a finish line, it's a starting gun. Jim's proof. 8 habits nearly killed him, but 8 new ones brought him back. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to do it all at once. But you've got to start. Stop skipping breakfast, your brain's begging for it. Get off the couch, your heart's worth it. Ditch the extra coffee, your body can't take it forever. Drink water, wake early, soak in the sun, calm your mind, move your bones. It's not too late, not for Jim, not for you. So here's my challenge. Pick one. Just one. Try it tomorrow. Maybe it's a walk around the block. Maybe it's a glass of water instead of that third cup. Whatever it is, own it. Because Jim didn't just save his mornings, he saved his future. The question's yours now. Where are you going to start? Don't let 65 be the end. Make it the beginning. Jim did. And if he can, you can too.